not muted,
Okay.
so avoid noise if you can.
Okay.
And I do have my grandpuppy here at my feet. He
Uh,
likes to jump up and make himself known. We'll just, oh, looks like we're live. Okay, hang on here.
Great.
Okay, welcome everybody. Oh, looks like we have Dr. Frank Cardis join me there. Frankie, let's get you off the screen here. Don't know how you got set up there, but hang on. Hey, welcome to Office Hours. I'm Drew Boyd, and Frankie, we're just going to have to get you off there somehow. That's all right. We'll just keep you on for the introduction, no problem.
Okay.
So this is Office Hours, LinkedIn Learning. I'm Drew Boyd, and in this program, I want to introduce some new research by Dr. Frank Cardis and his colleagues, who I'll bring on here in a minute. And it's an interesting topic that caught my eye. It's about the what's called the half-truth effect and its implications for sustainability. The authors are Alberto Barchetti, Emma Nabert, Susan Mantell, and Dr. Frank Cardis. Dr. Mantell and Dr. Cardis are on the faculty here at the University of Cincinnati. Alberta and Emma are PhD candidates, so it's really nice to have them on this program. Let me go ahead and bring everybody in here. There they are, the happy crew. Emma, thanks for joining. Nice to see you. Sue, pleasure to have you. Alberta, want to hear more about your program when you, I guess you're from Italy and you're going to be traveling there soon and coming back in a little while. Let's make sure we get together when you have a chance. And Dr. Cardis, you've been on the program before. Great to see you. Let's get into this topic of the half-truth effect. It just, when I saw the title, I mean, it really caught my eye. What is the half-truth effect?
Well, okay. The research was inspired by a poem by Tennyson, and the quote from the poem is, "A lie which is half a truth is ever the blackest of lies." And we'll talk about this quote in a little more detail. But the basic idea that Tennyson had is, if you mix truth and lies, it's hard to separate fact from fiction. People get it all mixed up. However, we also see there's some limiting conditions. The order in which you present the information is crucial, right? And also, some types of people are more susceptible than other types of people. But in general, we were surprised how strong the effect was. Uh, um, so, mixing up a true statement with a false statement increases belief in the false statement. Again, with these moderating variables in mind, controlling for lots of different things. We conducted some really clean experiments, controlling for lots of extraneous variables. But overall, we found strong support for Tennyson's idea. Tennyson's right. When you mix fact and fiction, it's hard to separate the two.
Okay, so this is a uh, something that's been around a while, half truth or half lie, depending on how you look at it. What is understood about it now from a psychological point of view? I mean, is this something that people regularly engage in? Is it? I mean, is it a common effect? Is it? What's it about? Is it something that where do we see it most prevalently? Um, who'd like to pitch in and
So,
tell us about that?
if, yeah, if I could jump in, the we found so the definition of a half truth has been around for a long time. It's in the dictionary, and as Frank said, it's anything that contains both a truth and a lie. But what our research shows is that if you put the true statement first, then the psychology is that that sets up a mindset. It sets up an acquiescence mindset, such that the person um, gives credence and trustworthiness to the speaker, and then accepts um, that trustworthiness transfers it to the next statement. So when we've got a true statement and then a false statement, they believe it more than the same statements presented in the opposite order. And so we call that the half-truth effect. So the true statement is believed as much as the true false statement, and then the false true statement is disbelieved as much as the false statement. And our experiment was set up such that we had counterbalanced them, so we had the same statements, and we showed that.
So it intrigues me because what you're saying then is how people sequence their comments can really matter in how they get their point across. Now, is this phenomena just with half truths and half lies? I mean, one false and one true, or are there other examples where ordering of what you say could matter?
Mhm.
It,
Yeah.
there's a lot of examples where, and in fact, that's kind of one of the ways we came up with this, is there are examples where they've asked people to evaluate things in the positive and then later asked them to make a unrelated economic choice. And when they were in the frame of acquiescence mindset, they made more positive choices on this unrelated task. So we find it in a lot of settings that you set your mind to something and then that carries forward to decisions made later.
Okay. So, how did you do this research, Emma and Alberto? You were sort of the driving forces in this. Tell us a little bit about how you set something like this up. How do you test for this?
So, if I can jump in, one of the most important things that we really wanted to tackle with this research project was to use stimuli and false information that wasn't necessarily out there, so to speak, in social media. And so, we really wanted to use information that the participants that we relied on for our research didn't necessarily see already. And that's important because past research on misinformation usually tackles the study by using false information that participants may already be aware of. We took a different approach and used misinformation and false information that was new, was novel. And that way we were better able to dive into people's reactions to new pieces of false information. And so we selected statements from different sources. We went on social media, for example, and we identified two topics related to sustainability that were sustainable living and GMOs that we thought were excellent candidates for this research project because they were also not as politically charged as other topics that we could have tried. And that allowed us to really dive into people's perspectives of new information that they encounter, false information, and without risking to sort of tap into different political aspects of their personalities as well as the information presented that could have impacted our results.
How many study subjects were there? What was the breadth of this, and where did you do this research?
So we relied on survey data that we collected on Prolific as well as the lab at the University of Cincinnati. I think in total we collected about 400, 500 participants overall, including the pre-tests. And again,
Wow.
the core of the research was to present them with different bits of false information and then present this information in different order to show that when we present a true piece of information first, um, the chance that belief in a false piece of information encountered after will increase.
And to Alberto's point, actually, with this pretest we ran, we looked at these statements to make sure that they were equally believable between the various political ideologies. So, a lot of misinformation research considers that if you are looking at something, oh, conservatives believe misinformation more often. Other research shows that liberals might be more susceptible. But our research really focused on making sure these statements were pre-tested as equally believable by political ideologies, which is why we wanted something that wasn't as politically charged, but is still really relevant with sustainability.
So there's a political angle of this. It appears. Two questions for you. First is this does this change in different cultures? Like if you were to do this research in Japan or in France, would you expect to see a different result? Were there any studies that would suggest that?
Well, we only tested the United States because
Okay.
that's kind of our frame of reference. But I would not suspect that it would be different. We feel like the underlying psychological premise that we're studying would
Hmm.
be similar across culture, particularly the idea that you're setting the mindset up with the first statement and then it is accepted with the second statement. I guess Alberto, maybe you could talk about whether misinformation is a problem in Italy as well. But we studied the United States just because that's where we are.
Yes, that's an excellent point. And in thinking about how misinformation is perceived in general, we really wanted to tap into the psychological traits that would span beyond cultures. Hopefully, even though that's an excellent question, and diving into the different aspects of cultures and subcultures and see how that could impact our effects and differences in believing half truths could be really interesting to see next.
Yeah. So let me get everybody back on the screen here. I'm trying to figure out. Let's see. There we go. Good. Add Frank. A little too much technology in my hands here. Kind of a dangerous. All right.
Hey, Drew,
There
if
we
you
go.
don't mind, one
Yeah.
last thing that actually might speak to your question also
Yeah.
is that one of our moderators that we tested that we look at of who might be more susceptible or less susceptible to the half truth effect is this idea of pardon the language, but the bullshit receptivity. Whether or not you are susceptible to just being gullible to misinformation, essentially. And
Huh.
we looked at that, and people who are high on the BSR scale, bullshit receptivity, um, they're more gullible. They're likely to take information in at face value and believe it, and so they fall prey to the half truth effect very easily. They just sort of believe everything's true. But also with the sorry, with people who are lower in bullshit receptivity, they want to get credibility. And what's most interesting there is that they still fall prey to the half truth effect, but they actually want to build credibility initially, which is where the structure of this information comes into play. Where if you have truth initially, they're like, okay, the box of credibility is checked off, we're good to go. And then they just keep believing it.
Good. So let's focus on why did this particular paper pick up the issue of sustainability? It sounds like you could have applied the half truth effect to a lot of things,
Mhm.
especially in today's society. And by the way, we're getting quite a few participants. Speaking of cultural, Lillian from Brazil, thank you. Sasheen, good to see you again. We have Rosanna from from Peru. Dr. Tobias Adam from Mallorca, welcome. And for those of you on the stream today, if you have questions, go ahead and post those into the comments. We're monitoring the comments, and we'll be sure to pose that into the panel if you'd like to learn more about this fascinating topic. So, why
Mhm.
sustainability, team? What was that about? Why that choice?
I think you're right, Drew. This research could be applied to understanding misinformation in general, uh, in politics and all over the place. Um, we focused on sustainability just because it's an important issue, and there's a lot of misinformation about sustainable issues. In the paper, we give a lot of specific examples of misinformation in the domain of sustainability. But I think you're right. This research could be applied to anywhere where misinformation is a problem. And of course, this is a growing problem. There's a the research on misinformation is growing extensively right now too. There's a lot of people doing a lot of interesting work on this topic. But if I may, let me give you the full Tennyson quote. Okay, so the full quote goes that a lie which is half the truth is ever the blackest of lies. That a lie which is all lie may be met and fought with outright. But a lie which is part of truth is a harder matter to fight. And I've been interested in the topic of resistance to persuasion for quite a while too. This is also, uh, again, this quote's very relevant to that. If you just tell lies, people are going to resist, right? And there's lots of ways people can resist. They can counter argue, they can tune out the message, they can derogate the source. There's all kinds of things people can do to try to resist incorrect information, invalid information. But it's surprisingly hard to do. If you mix the claims, it's very hard to separate true claims from false claims. And I think in politics, this happens all the time. The other really remarkable thing about our research is we're careful to present true claims and false claims about the same topic but the claims themselves were logically unrelated. So even though the claims were logically unrelated, we still got this carryover effect. So if you present a true statement first, it carries over and people are more likely to believe the subsequent false statement. We also found the opposite though. If you present a false statement first, that carries over and people are less likely to believe the true statement that follows, right? So uh, this is a great example of a carryover effect. What happens at time one carries over and influences what happens at time two.
So give me an example.
Uh, Alberto came up with a lot of the claims. Can you tell us about some of the claims you used?
Sure. So, for example, related to sustainable living,
Mm-hmm.
one of the claims that we used was that we started with the true piece of information, which was that sustainable practices may be costly for businesses, which on its own is factually true. Sustainable practices can sometimes be expensive to implement.
Mm-hmm.
And then we followed it with a piece of information, which is that um, therefore, adopting sustainable practices means putting the environment over business and over business practices in general, and choosing the environment over people, which of course is not necessarily true. It's false. So that was, for example, one of the instances of false information and half truths that we use for our experiments.
Mm-hmm.
So
One thing that's really
yeah, go ahead, Sid.
interesting. Yeah, one thing that's really interesting is there's this thing called the poison parasite counter, which we also put in this paper. It was developed by Cialdini, and what he studied it in the context of political advertisements. He took a political ad and he inserted the counter arguments of why things were false in those political ads and showed that people were less likely to believe the false information when it was actually inserted in. So we did that with these claims. So we showed the claim, asked them how true it was, then showed them this poison parasite counter where we said, okay, this first statement's true, but it doesn't imply the second statement, or the second statement is false and here's why. And then we gave them an intervening task and asked again about the original pair of statements. It turns out that the poison parasite counter, as Cialdini suggested, reduces believability of everything, but the half truth effect remains. And that is that if the true statement is first, it's more believed than if the true statement is second. And so that was really interesting because it helps to kind of give a little caveat on how you can counter false information that's out there.
So when the half truth effect happens, are you telling me that people know that the phrase is false and the second one is true, or that one of them's false, one of them's true, but just the way they're grouped together all of a sudden makes all of it more believable? Do they know that one of the statements is inherently false?
No. Um, yeah, it was up to them to evaluate the statements. So we didn't explicitly label anything as true or false. We just did a lot of pre-testing to make sure the true statements were true and the false statements were false. By the way, we used a lot of statements. So this effect generalizes across a lot of stimuli. But yeah, we didn't explicitly label anything as true or false. It was really up to the participant to figure that out on their own.
Okay, let's get into this idea of what do you do to counter this? You've alluded to some of this, the so-called debiasing effect. Let me get Alberto in there.
Mhm.
And our participants want to hear. In fact, let me just pose a question here brought to us
Mhm.
by Joshua. Joshua says, did you find in your research if there is a correlation for people believing half truths more in rural areas compared to urban areas? Okay, interesting.
Yeah, we don't have that variable in our data set. Yeah, we didn't measure that. It's an interesting question though, and we do believe everything's moderated, right? There's boundary conditions and limiting conditions to everything. We found one right? The BSR. But the
Yep.
BSR, of course, is correlated with lots of other things too. We're doing research on that as well.
One
But
of our guests is a familiar name, Ryan
oh, okay.
Gaffney. Ryan, thanks for joining us. He is a former PhD student here at the University of Cincinnati. Good to see you, Ryan.
Hi, Ryan.
So,
And I guess I
go
wouldn't
ahead, Sue.
from our research that there'd be a difference from rural areas versus urban areas. We don't have any indication that the psychology would be different in those two areas. One thing that a lot of the false information research has looked at is political ideology. And in the United States, the rural areas may tend to be more Republican, but our research shows that this half-truth effect it impacts both Republicans and Democrats equally. It's not a political ideology difference. So we don't have any indication that there'd be a difference.
Yeah, I see you could make that jump, but interesting question. Kind of like the
Mhm.
cultural question: are there other moder? And as Frank said, there are other things that can moderate this effect.
Yeah.
Uh, so, what's the key takeaway here? If a person is sitting in front of their TV or reading online news information or a report from a company or
Mhm.
something in their job they hear, what's going to be a typical situation where they encounter the half truth effect, and what should they do about it in the moment?
Mhm.
So
If I
it's
could take that one.
Go ahead, Emma.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Emma.
I think really, in order to counter it, you need to be proactive. Instead of, you know, too often we look at things and we establish credibility initially, and then we're sort of led down this lovely breadcrumb trail of lies. And
Mhm.
so, in order to counter that, you'll want to initially, not only initially establish your credibility, but continue to consider what is the information you're being presented and how truthful is that, rather than just kind of glazing over that credibility and trustworthiness from the beginning.
Give me an example when somebody's going to see this at work. What would
Mhm.
they look for to know that they're about to be a victim of the half truth effect? What's it going to look like?
I think you want to look at multi-part statements.
Yeah.
So our simulated a Facebook post or an Instagram post,
Mhm.
but one of the things that started our path down this towards this study was that many of the false information that's out there are very much multi-part.
Mhm.
They start with a statement, and then they may build on it, maybe with a second unrelated but possibly true statement, and then they conclude with a falsity. So when you're
Mhm.
presented with a multi-part argument, check each part individually,
Mhm.
because each part should be considered individually. It may or may not be true. And then also, our research says that if you see the therefore, your mind just assumes that it is a causal and effect statement, but it may not be. And so you want to dissect the statement, much like you did in high school English,
Mhm.
to identify the parts.
Mhm.
Yeah, it sounds to me like a common technique we use in creative thinking to
Mhm.
chop it up, chunk it down into its pieces. And what I'm hearing you say is try to remove any effect of stringing together comments. I know in the field of persuasion, we talk about the effect of the word "but" in a
Yes.
sentence.
Mhm.
Uh, I think the Tampa Bay Lightning are a great team, but they sure looked pretty weak when playing the Colorado Avalanche, to make
Mhm.
a reference to hockey. And what the
Mhm.
word "but" does is it tends to make you forget what that first part of the sentence is.
Mhm.
Uh, and so ordering effects matter, is what you're telling me.
Yes.
Now there's a dishonest part of this, I'm guessing too, an ethical issue. We should bring
Mhm.
that to light. Uh, what are the ethical issues with respect to this, and what counsel would you have for people on the ethical use of this, especially for people in communications roles, whether it's
Mhm.
journalism, marketing, human resources? What do we have to keep in mind from an ethical point of view?
Well, fact checking is very important. So, and people should be careful not to believe everything they see on TV and in social media. It's pretty easy to fall into this trap. People tend to hum along on automatic pilot. So if some things make sense, they continue to think things make sense when actually they should be more careful. They should, uh, and I think this is really common. I don't think this is just gullibility. Another thing we looked at is we included uh, a trust scale. Well, how much do you, in general, how much do you trust other people? And we got all kinds of mixed results. You might expect that as trust increases, people should be more susceptible, but that's not what we found. This trust as an individual difference variable uh, was not an important moderator in this particular study because there were so many mixed effects associated with this variable. But I think misinformation's everywhere. It's on TV, social media, radio. We really can't escape it nowadays. So people need to be careful. We need to continue to resist messages that don't make sense. And as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of ways to resist persuasive messages.
Yeah.
One thing we considered while we were doing this is
Yes.
we didn't want our research to be used by the bad actors, right?
Right.
So we, in order to study this and to give tools to people to counter it, you also have to show how it happens and risk giving those tools to the bad actors. And so I guess the other side of that is to get that information out, let people know what they can do to protect themselves. So to counter that kind of ethical issue.
That's a really important point, Sue. One of my old professors a long time ago did a lot of research on factors that led um, teenagers to start smoking. And he was complaining that the only people that read all his papers and that came to all of his talks were people from the tobacco industry. So, yes, that's a really important point.
All right. Well, we are out of time. I want to thank our panel, Dr. Frank Cardis, Dr. Sue Mantell, and PhD candidates Emma Nabert and Alberto Barchetti. Thank you very much for joining us. Continue the great work you're doing here at the University of Cincinnati. All right. There's Frank again. Frank, I don't know how to get you off there. Let's see if I do this. There we go. All right. We are out of time. Thank you for joining us here on Office Hours at LinkedIn Learning. Next week, we're going to get into this topic of creativity, innovation, and the differences in how men and women approach this. What are the differences? What are the similarities? I think you'll find this very interesting. I'm going to be joined by my team member and colleague, Darla Wilkinson. Looking forward to having Darla on the live stream. Don't forget about the podcast. You get this every week, and you can find it at all the usual places: Spotify, Apple, Google, etc. And that is it. We'll see. There's Frank again. All right, Frank. We'll see you. Bye bye, all.